Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk once again about the concept of globalism, what it really represents versus what its proponents claim it represents. You've even seen this from the US media in the wake of Trump's election. People comparing globalism favorably with nationalism, I guess conflating all concepts of sovereignty and independence, liberation and freedom with the Nazi Party from Germany or something like that. It's all they can do. If you look back at the long span of human history, let's say this first, and it's an important point that people don't bring up enough. Every single human culture, from the dawn of the very concept of a city-state or even a tribal region, up through until the late pre-modern period, was nationalistic. There never was a culture at the time that wasn't. They simply never existed. Now, to relegate all of human past for the first many thousands of years of its development post-archaic period to a bunch of evil, despicable bigots who hated everybody is quite clearly wrong. We look back at some of the better ancient cultures, some of the greater empires and republics and so forth spawned in antiquity. And the people there had an appreciation for foreign cultures, but there was no concept that if a person from a foreign culture tried to tell you what to do, that you were under any onus to do so. There was no concept that, along with trade, necessarily came the idea of completely open borders. There was never an attempt to homogenize. What little attempt to homogenize populations that came in these eras was the result of what we would generally relegate to the dustbin of corruption at the time. Essentially, for instance, Rome. When Rome decides it's going to take what had been a pluralist approach, tolerance of all of the various religions under the banner of Rome at the time, minus, of course, the Christians, the early Christian waves. Then they made Christianity the state religion and began killing people who, of course, would not worship Jesus Christ. Now, millions of people died as the result of this over the span of several centuries. This was then perpetuated into the future. And from that point forward, many of the states that existed were essentially theocratic, or they were in partnership with Rome, with the theocracy that spawned there in its several forms over time, various offshoots of Christianity. We'd think of the Orthodox hegemony of the East. We'd think of the Protestant movement and what that caused over time. But there was never any globalism. For instance, within ancient Rome, yes, multiple racial and ethnic groups were absorbed into the Roman Empire. But Rome remained homogenized in the civic sense. That is, there was one set of Roman laws, you would obey them. There was one set of Roman standards, you would obey them. There was one type of Roman armor that you'd be using. They didn't just simply let the barbarians, other than mercenaries on the fringes of the Roman Empire, design their own clothes if they intended to join in official pro-Roman combat or anything like that. It was very standardized. It was very orderly. It's actually at the point that this sort of begins to break down that the Roman Empire in turn begins to break down again because of corruption from the top, because of too much centrality in many ways, as well as the splitting, the schism between East and West, and the failure, of course, to respond to the early sacking of Rome by Alaric. But there was never any globalism in this era. Globalism was dreamed up by people who thought, I believe, that they were doing the right thing. Post-First World War, the basic concept was that by drawing cultures closer together, you could avoid warfare. What happened, though, is that very quickly other people who were not so scrupulous realized, hey, yeah, that's actually a great idea, not to prevent war, but to draw people together into a post-national authority. We can abuse them more easily. We make these states inter-reliant, draw them more and more closely together, and we can abuse people at a whim. Eventually, we essentially run the world. What has happened in the modern era? We see no better example than the EU of today, although that's only one example. What's happened is that in order for a nation to function, it can make some of its own decisions. Its people, though, only have the illusion of a democratic republic or whatever other representative system they may be under. We look at North Korea, or one of these tin horn states. People don't have the illusion of choice any more than they have a real tangible choice. When we look at many of the Western countries, though, these so-called free nations, Do people really have choices? Or do their governments have to operate within essentially a globalized set of standards? Now, again, the original sort of set of standards were primarily, well, yeah, we shouldn't be torturing people and slaughtering civilians and deploying like chemical weapons and things of that nature, things that most people agreed were positive steps forward to prevent large numbers of casualties and a huge amount of human misery. It was essentially a good idea. But then, like all government endeavors, like all centralized endeavors, you got added layers over and over and over again of regulatory systems that now nations, in order to continue trading and having friendly relations with all the other nations, feel compelled to actually join to. For instance, membership in the UN, which is little more than constant quarreling. It's completely ineffective. Some of these military alliances that are in some cases very lopsided. We would think of NATO. NATO's lopsided. It's essentially the decisions are made by the US, and the US in turn puts up basically all of the money for NATO. Now, nobody asks the population of the US, oh, do you want to continue funding this project? Nobody asks the people in Europe whether they want to continue essentially following US dictates on NATO's military policy. Both sides are losing and gaining in this approach. Now, you can make the pragmatic argument that NATO is necessary, and I would. I think it should be completely rebalanced and overhauled over time, but yes, it would be necessary. But under its current form, it's just a little more than a globalist scheme. But what globalism really represents is anti-democratic post-nationalism. If you think that the concept of a powerful national state is bad, that it's a form of fascism, that it's authoritarian, that it's abusive in some way, if you think that that sort of sovereignty a la national borders is a bad thing, then you should really hate post-nationalism, because post-nationalism is essentially one group of people ruling the world through a regulatory system. A bunch of bureaucrats. It's an oligarchic system. It is one step away, and it will eventually devolve into a dictatorship. All you need is one strong arm individual who will have the following qualities. They will be very well spoken. They'll be intelligent. They will almost certainly have risen up from the lower middle classes. They won't start out rich. They'll have a military background and a lot of friends and allies within the military. They may have been a bureaucrat at some point in their life. And this individual, who will come in the future if we don't stop globalism, will rule the world. Now, Christians would immediately assume that it was the Antichrist. This is where you, by the way, get your self-fulfilling prophecy and your mass human chaos. That's where you get it. Not because there's an actual Antichrist, there's not. But because people will be looking for one, and they will identify this sort of dictator figure over much of the world to be one. The only thing stopping this right now from happening is that we have a multipolar world, but it's not even clear that we're going to continue in that. One of the problems, this is actually the funny part, when the United States is sort of West, like NATO, tries to work with like Russia, what it's doing is eliminating the other pole of power in a passive sense. That actually makes it easier to enslave the world. It can prevent nuclear war, it can prevent mass human suffering, but then it brings about human suffering. And herein lies something that a lot of people don't want to think about, and that's the paradox of humanity's advancement itself. We are doomed as a human race, regardless of what we do. Transhumanism can make you live 1,000 years. You'll still get killed violently at some point. If we become globalized, fully globalized, it's going to lead to utter chaos. It will turn into a dictatorship. It is innate to the human population, the amalgamation of power behind increasingly smaller units. It will happen. If we don't, we'll probably suffer a nuclear war sooner rather than later. And even if we manage to balance everything, we'll get wiped out by an epidemic or an asteroid or something like that. We are doomed as a species. We will be wiped off the face of the earth in due time. Give it a few thousand years, we probably won't even be on this rock anymore. We won't exist. And even if we do exist, eventually, yeah, we're going to get completely slaughtered. Unless aliens step in, really advanced aliens to preserve a nucleus of humanity on some space base somewhere. That's literally our only chance at this point. I hope people do realize that. We were born into what could be a very resource-poor planet. Maybe we just don't have the resources to leave this general part of the galaxy. In which case, we're completely screwed. We're basically in a zoo of sorts. But I'm getting a little bit off topic, of course. But globalism is not your friend. If you're interested in, women's rights, gay rights, whatever kind of rights you happen to support, on any side of any political spectrum, you should hate post-nationalism. Because it's like the system here. When someone who's on the left side of the spectrum, so-called, again, it's, they're basically the same thing. Somebody on the left gets into power. People on the left then say, it's fine for the government to have more and more power. And people on the right, they complain about it. Then the right gets into power. Those same people on the left that had no problem with increasing government authority before now cry foul. And people on the right have no problem with it. And it moves back and forth between these two. Now imagine you have one oligarchic sort of authority over the whole world. Some wise council of elders somewhere, of whatever persuasion or race they may be. All that you need is for them to change their minds on a couple of fundamental issues and you get a mass human purge and a lot of people totally alienated. And if it begins to break down, what then? If you finally realize you're being slowly more and more enslaved and you actually take up arms, what happens then? Even more human suffering. Mass worldwide civil war, revolution, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions dead. Maybe these people in their total corruption decide to use nuclear weapons against the world population that they're trying to consolidate under their control. Therein lies the problem. Global cooperation has other problems too. Let's say for a moment that the governments of the world became aware that a massive asteroid was going to hit Earth and basically wipe out most of the life on its surface. What would they do? They'd cooperate together to build a bunch of bunkers underground, and they'd go in them, and you wouldn't, and you'd die. Well, we're making that cooperation possible, aren't we? We're letting them share intelligence. We're letting them share military resources. They meet with one another in private, and we have no apparent legal expectation of knowing what the hell they're talking about in their secret meetings. All they have to do is slap the word confidential on them, and you'll never see them. Well, there you go. Post-nationalism either directly leads to or at least facilitates the wiping out of most of humanity, if not all of it. Post-nationalism is the purest anti-democratic movement that you could possibly conceive of. It's much more anti-democratic than any communist movement. It's more anti-democratic than any dedicated fascist movement, no matter how bad or how abusive it may be. It's far more anti-democratic than outright National Socialism could ever possibly imagine. It's 1,000 times more abusive, and it's also enabled more in its abuse because of the level of cooperation and the scale of centrality that it exhibits. So what I would warn people, when they say globalism is better than nationalism because look at what some so-called nationalist party did back in the 1940s, look at what globalism's done since then. That's when it really began to take hold. Are we safer? Are fewer people dying? Are there less famines? Is there less terrorism? Are there less instances of abuse by every government in the world? No, everything's largely worse than it was. Everything's worse. Simply remaining a neutral state. Look at Switzerland in the Second World War. Oh, we're neutral. We'll also kill anybody who climbs up into our mountains. Okay, we'll leave you alone, says Hitler, because, I don't really want to deal with this shit right now. Oh, yeah, we'll leave you alone, say the Allies, because, we haven't attacked us. Who gives a fuck? And so they just march around Switzerland or with permission through it or something along those lines. It would be better just to have a world of sovereign nations that cooperate and are friends with one another, but do not create any post-national dictates or regulations. Beyond a very limited scope, what we need is a world constitution to constrain globalism. We need a world constitution, something as opposed to a world regulatory body, a world court, a world authority. We need a world limitation on authority. Something that can delineate international cooperation while constraining it to a very, very small number of limited roles where it actually belongs. Such as, some sort of world cooperation to stamp out child trafficking or something like that. Those are proper uses, a world police of sorts to go after international syndicates and so forth. But something that could never be abused, that could never be used to bring about actual dictatorial post-nationalism. That's the real threat of the world today. Globalism's way worse. It'd be better if we were under the control of a Nazi party than to be under the control of globalism. We'd be better off as communists, but sovereign communists, than globalists. It's far worse. I can say as many bad things about socialism, communism, National Socialism, or any of these movements as I want. They will all be invariably better than a global fascist authority, which is what we are headed towards. There's resistance. The EU is beginning to shatter. That much is clear. The older order, the earlier wave of globalism, is now being reverted to. We're buying ourselves more time, but that's all we're doing. More globalism will attempt to rise up. What we need is much more safeguarded national sovereignty. People in disarmed states need to take back their armaments, for number one. Number two, we need to start constraining our governments to end these proxy wars because they're just serving that same purpose. Number three, even more than attempting to cooperate with the other polar powers of the world, that is Russia and China essentially. Rather than doing that, we need to first look at ourselves, regain our own sovereignty so we can make more sound decisions. As long as we're caught up in this network of westernized globalism, there's really no point to it. Because if you eliminate those other poles, happy as though that may seem, it might be great. Communism's gone from China, they no longer have nukes. Russia has joined the West, or they've collapsed or something. They don't have nukes. We no longer have any competitors in a military sense on the world stage. Okay, great. 1,000 years of peace. Oh, wait, that's right. We're at the head of globalism itself. Now there's nothing to stand in the way of the more corrupt post-national authorities. Not even D.C., it's post-national authorities that will be in control of it, to dedicate their time to designing more and more authoritarian, more and more constraining world regulations. That's what would happen. And we need to safeguard against it through any means necessary. This should draw together even the most far-left and far-right individuals in mutual disdain for such a system. That would be my warning to the world. You're so worried about, oh, leftists will riot, oh, right-wingers, they'll be racist and take over or something like that. That's small time. That's peanuts compared to what's coming if we don't stop globalism. So many people die you won't even be able to bury them all. You think that the Black Death came back at the same time that you also had a worldwide purge or something like that. It'd be terrible. Most of humanity, most of the life on the Earth's surface could get completely wiped off. And you'd be suffering. You wouldn't be one of those people in one of those special bunkers, 500 feet below the Earth's surface in some old salt mine somewhere reinforced by 1,000 feet of concrete. You won't be one of those lucky few. You won't be down there with all of the goods to last you through Armageddon, and a full accompaniment of military hardware and a nuclear generator to boot so that you can grow all of your crops down there in your little solar systems. It's just never going to happen. You won't be down there. You'll be on the surface suffering. That's about all. Peace out.